So, hello and welcome along to the Talk About Doubts teaching course. Once again, I'm here with my good friend and colleague, Eric Manning. You might recognize him from the YouTube channel Testify, which I highly recommend, especially on New Testament scholarship and the resurrection and the case for the case for contemporary miracles, which is a subject we're going to be talking about this evening. You might recall, if you've been present at past sessions of the Talk About Doubts teaching course, that I defend 6 different lines of argument for the truth of Christianity. Those would be the case for the resurrection, the argument from the conversion of the Apostle Paul, the trilemma argument, or C.S. Lewis, the argument from messianic prophecy, the argument from contemporary miracles, and the argument from the survival of the nation of Israel against all odds. So we've covered 4 of those 6 arguments in considerable detail in past weeks, and this week we're going to be considering the argument from modern miracles, and this is a topic that has unfortunately been neglected in contemporary apologetic discourse, and there's some great books on the subject that I would recommend, including Craig Keener's 2-volume set on miracles, which is an excellent review of various contemporary miracles. It's a bit of a mixed bag in terms of their relative strength. There's some really good examples and there's some not so good examples. And he also has another book, which is a more condensed presentation of the argument. And that book is called Miracles Today. And I would recommend Miracles Today more than the recommended 2-volume set, because he tends to prioritize some of the better documented contemporary miracles in that volume. So I highly recommend starting with Miracles Today by Craig Keener. There's also J.P. Moreland's book, which is A Guide to Experiencing Miracles. Do I have the title right, Eric?
Yeah, I believe so.
And there's Robert Larmer has also done some good work on this subject. Lee Strobel has a book called The Case for Miracles, which I think is also a good introduction to the subject. There's also some great content on YouTube as well, including on Eric's own channel, where he's interviewed various people, including Robert Larmer and J.P. Moreland and Craig Keener, etc. So anyway, with that, I'm going to turn over for the first part of our evening to Eric, and he's going to present on the subject of modern miracles and Christianity, giving some case studies and laying out some criteria for evaluating contemporary miracle claims. So I'll turn over to you, Eric.
All right. Well, thanks, Jonathan, for having me, and thank you guys for joining here. And so I just threw these slides together over the last couple of hours. So if you see any typos or anything crazy, just you guys get to be the guinea pigs that help me straighten some of that mess out. So I appreciate that. But we're talking about modern miracles in Christianity. And as a epigraph here, I've chosen 1 Corinthians 2:5, which says that your faith may stand not in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. And I'm sure as we go along, you'll see why I chose that particular verse. And so why bring up modern miracles? As Jonathan has said, it's not something that you see a lot of apologists do. I think I even, in my conversation with J.P. Moreland, asked him why he thinks that's the case. And he honestly thinks that a lot of Christians are almost kind of embarrassed of these stories. I'm not sure why that is the case. Maybe it just seems like it's not as intellectual and it's just something that you hear about reported elsewhere. But I think it is definitely through the work of Craig Keener and J.P. Moreland, as Jonathan mentioned, and others. It is becoming a little bit of there's a resurgence of it. And so, but the reason why we want to talk about this is that critics frequently question the historical reliability of the Gospels and Acts, primarily due to philosophical reasons centered around the presence of miracles within them. And so if you just go to the biblical critics, a lot of them, and even if like there's a certain class on the historical Jesus that I was listening to, and the instructor of the class just flat out said, well, we know this story isn't historical and it contained a miracle because we know those things don't happen. Like he just flat out said it. So this is an actually pretty common view among academics. I'm not saying that it's limited to every academic who is criticizing the Bible, but it is something that you see a lot. It is very prevalent. Case in point here is D.F. Strauss, which is basically kind of the father of modern biblical criticism. And he says that the contradictions between the supernatural accounts and the natural element, which alone is historically available, cannot be reconciled so long as the Gospels, or even a single one of them, was taken truly and fully historical. This indeed they could not be, for the simple reason that they contain supernaturalism. And so here's D.F. Strauss. He's bringing in this anti-supernatural bias right out the gate, and he's just saying the Gospels can't be fully historical. They have to be, at the very least, partially embellished. This is Gerd Ludemann, another New Testament scholar. He's debated like William Lane Craig. In fact, the book that I'm quoting here is out of a debate between him and William Lane Craig that was put into book form. And it says that anybody who says that he, meaning Jesus, rose from the dead is faced with another problem that I shall address later, namely that if you say Jesus rose from the dead biologically, you would have to presuppose that a decaying corpse, which is already cold and without blood in its brain, could be made alive again. I think that's nonsense. And so, again, right off the gate, he's just saying miracles can't happen. It's almost as if, like, why are we having this debate? Because this stuff is all nonsense. And here's Bart Ehrman. I love this picture I got here of Bart. This is with his debate with Justin Bass, who's actually part of the Talk About Doubts team, although we might have some disagreements on how he approached that particular debate, but we'll set that aside. But in his debate with Justin Bass, he did make a very telling statement. And he says, I don't think that anybody was raised from the dead because it violates the laws of nature. I don't think that God can break the laws of physics any more than he could break the laws of mathematics. And so he's basically saying, like, miracles just can't happen. It's impossible. This is extremely philosophically naive. We could go on a whole other side journey, but I believe Jonathan probably covered that in some of the very early classes in talking about, David Hume and philosophical approaches to miracles. Ehrman is going almost, I think, a little bit further than Hume. This is just dumb. But anyways, my harshness towards Bart aside, he's just basically coming to the conclusions already determined Jesus didn't raise from the dead because the laws of physics are just like the laws of math. Miracles just don't happen. And so what if our background knowledge was a little bit different? What if these things are reported, and what if they are actually have some good evidence to them? And so that's what we're going to talk about. And so in order to rebut the miracle skeptic, we want to take a two-step approach. Number one, we want to demonstrate the existence of numerous religiously contextualized events that are well documented but lack an adequate natural explanation. And we'll go through some test cases as we go through. And secondly, from there, we can, in the next step, we can reasonably deduce that Christianity provides the most plausible explanation for these occurrences, prompting critics to reconsider their philosophical biases against the text. And so one of the things that Jonathan has done an excellent job of is giving you guys ample reasons to trust the text. He's given you arguments from external confirmations, historical confirmations, undesigned coincidences, unexplained illusions, and line after line after line after line after line of why you can trust the Gospels, and how that leads us to the next step of being able to argue for the resurrection. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people who have just been poisoned by a lot of bad arguments, but they give miracles such like a low prior of actually occurring that no matter what you say, it just seems like if you just look at my conversations with, say, Derek Lambert on the Myth Vision podcast, we've had a couple of conversations. He's been on my channel. Like, no matter what you say, he's just going to see mythology. He's going to have a very low prior when it comes to looking at the evidence. Now, I think Derek is wrong in his approach at looking at that evidence, and I don't think that he takes it seriously enough. And I think the textual evidence is good enough. But not everybody's just going to be able to evaluate undesigned coincidences and external confirmations. I think they should be, and I think they should be intellectually curious enough to get into it, but just not everybody's going to see it. And some of these evidences, it may have taken a little bit of time to sink in. But if we can show that miracles happen in our background knowledge, that there are really credible reports, then suddenly I think our skepticism of the text, just because they report miracles, should change. Hopefully that makes sense. And so how do we establish a miraculous healing? Okay. What are some criteria? We don't want to just, because there are lots of miracles reported in lots of different religions. Okay. And so we don't want to be special pleading here. We don't want to just say, oh yeah, believe every miracle reports. We're not saying we're not advocating for hapless credulity, right? We want there to be some skepticism, because there are a lot of these reports and a lot of them are bunk. They're either lies or they're people who are mistaken. And so how do we go about establishing a miraculous healing? Well, this is the Lambertini criterion that we're going to go through here. It's named after Cardinal Lambertini, who actually later became Pope Benedict XIV, I believe. And he established these different criteria because during this time, after the Reformation, the Protestant reformers went pretty heavy cessationist. And the reason why, obviously there was a lot of bad and bunk miracle claims that were out there and that were being brought forward as, hey, the Catholic Church is the one true church and we have the miracles. And a lot of the reformers were like, your miracles are really poorly evidenced. And so Lambertini was like, we need to have some rigorous criteria that we can develop, that we can talk to with those who are skeptical. Now, these can apply these could apply to any miracle claim, okay? It's not just Catholic miracles. It's not Protestant miracles. It's not even just Christian miracles. You could apply these across the board. But I think that what we're going to find is that there's not a lot of these kind of miracle claims in other religions that pass this criteria. And so, number one, the diagnosis and the healing were both medically documented. If we have some sort of medical documentation, that is obviously huge, right? That the illness was organic and not just psychosomatic. And so this wasn't just something that happened in the mind, I feel better after somebody prayed and then the psychosomatic effect kind of goes away. We want to make sure that it's not something like that, or just an illness that just existed in the person's mind. It wasn't really an illness. We want it to be actually medically diagnosed. That we need to know that the illness was progressive and showed no improvement prior to the healing. We want to know that the healing is permanent and it's not just temporary. I heard one case of a story. This was really sad. It even made the local news, of a child who was healed of cancer, and everybody was saying it was a miracle. Well, 2 years later, the cancer resurfaced. The child died. So I don't think that's a very strong miracle claim. It's a sad story, but people got too excited to report a miracle there. Not a good thing. We want to make sure that we would wait, some time before we're saying, yes, this is definitely a miracle. That the healing was instantaneous, that it wasn't just gradual, okay? And we need to know that the healing was complete and not merely partial, and so that it was something that was complete in the fact that they regained complete use of whatever functions were lost because of the illness, and that the healing was spontaneous and not attributable to treatment. And so if there's other treatment involved and different things going on there, but then they were healed, well, could it be attributed to medicine or doctor's procedures or different else, or God? We're not saying that God wasn't involved, but we're just saying that that's not strong enough to pass the particular criteria. So it's important to note, if it doesn't mean that a miracle didn't happen if all of these things, all of these different criteria aren't fulfilled. But if all of them are fulfilled, or even most of them, I would say that it does give us good evidence that a miracle did happen. Does that make sense? All right. And so I'm going to look at a couple of, I think I got 4 case studies here. Now, I actually talked to the gentleman that you're seeing on the screen right now. I believe it was on Tuesday. And I'll be publishing that video tomorrow on my channel. I might even throw it in the Discord server early for you guys if you want to check it out. But this is Bruce Van Atta. Now, Bruce Van Atta was a like a truck mechanic in Wisconsin, and he was working on a, I believe it was a logging truck. Late one evening, he had already worked like a very long day. I think he said he worked like 14 hours that particular day. Anyways, he's underneath the truck, looking at some things. And then as he's under it, the jack ends up giving way. And this giant truck comes bearing down on him and basically pancakes him to the ground right below like his lower stomach area. Okay. He said that blood shot out of his mouth. And he actually began to leave his body. One of the things that he reported is he could actually, from the ceiling for a while, this is a totally different subject, but he was having like a near-death experience where he actually left his body. He could see the EMTs working on him and different things like that. He could see his friend apologizing to him because he had a friend there that felt guilty, responsible about the jack. And there was just a lot going on. I won't get into all the details, but basically, he should have been dead. He's the only person that was documented to have survived such an accident and survived such injuries. He should have been dead in like, I think it was 4 to 8 minutes, and he survived for quite a while. Yeah, 10 minutes. And so he had to actually have his small intestine. They were severely damaged and they had to be removed. He underwent several different surgeries. He was left with only 121 centimeters. Now, your average small intestines is 600 centimeters, and he had to have his ileum reduced from 350 to 25 centimeters. Well, you can't live like that. You're going to starve to death. He was unable to digest food at all. He was fed completely through an IV. The doctors would not even want him to eat ice chips. He said he was a bad patient. He would yell at them about, just let me eat ice chips. Come on, you guys. But anyways, see the channel for the full story. But he dropped a lot of weight quickly. He said he basically, at the time of before he received prayer, he basically said he looked like a Holocaust survivor. He had let me see the next, there we go. He had a friend who was in New York, who was out of state. His wife was asking for people to pray, and people were praying for him. And an acquaintance of his who lived in New York State woke up one morning at 5 a.m. and felt like he heard a voice, which he attributed to the Holy Spirit, to go and pray for Bruce. He didn't want to do that. And so he argued with God and basically was like, no, I don't think I can make that work. Well, the next morning, during his time of prayer, he heard that same voice tell him to go pray for Bruce. And so he decided to obey. He visited the hospital. He prayed for healing. He commanded the small intestine to grow in Jesus's name. And Van Atta felt an electric jolt go through his entire body and was actually healed. His small intestine, from all the tests and different things that they could do, showed that it doubled in length and became fully functional. And this was confirmed by multiple radiologists, including a Christian doctor, including an atheist doctor. Multiple people had looked at this. And so he was able to start eating normal food again. He regained all of his weight. Obviously, he's still healthy to this day. I just talked to him the other day, defying all medical odds. And so if you ever hear skeptics say it's just kind of a common trope, why doesn't God heal amputees? Well, this is actually probably a little more complicated than regrowing an arm, okay? Now, did he regrow his entire intestine? No, but it more than doubled in size. And it's either like 50 to, they estimate 50, I think, to 70% back. And the whole point is he's alive, he's walking, he's well. And through multiple tests, everything that they have, every means that we have, besides taking the guy apart and measuring it, which we can't really do because it would kill him, this was something that's been confirmed. And so now, interestingly enough, Van Natta later went into ministry, and this is Chris Gunderson, who Van Natta actually ended up praying for. Now, Chris Gunderson, you can see his story on my friend Than from Exploring Realities channel. He actually interviewed Chris. This is a picture of from the interview. And at 2 weeks old, he was just projectile vomiting. Like, he could not digest anything. He was diagnosed with gastroparesis, and needed to have feeding tubes basically surgically put into him. And so gastroparesis is basically your stomach is paralyzed. Your stomach basically doesn't work. And so it impedes the stomach from emptying. Medical technology manages symptoms but offers no cure. Most people who are diagnosed with gastroparesis die before they turn 18 years old. Surgeons added, I'm not even going to try and pronounce this, but basically some apparatus at 11 months old to reroute the stomach from emptying. And then they relied on tube feeding for 16 years, and he struggled with inadequate nutrition. And so he would try and do normal things. He would try and go out, play, do things that kids do, even played on the high school basketball team. But sometimes he would just completely pass out right in the middle of the game, and they just would take care of him. They just acted like it was normal. They were just trying to allow him to live as normal of a childhood as he can, but he couldn't eat really anything. Every now and then he would just want to taste food, but he'd have to spit it out. He couldn't digest the food at all. Definitely go check out the video of his testimony, because you get a lot more details. And I can put it in the Discord. Anyways, he attended a Pentecostal church in Oregon. Bruce Van Natta was actually telling his testimony there. After the service, his parents kind of dragged him up there and had Bruce pray for Chris, and Chris agreed to be prayed for. He said that he felt like electricity go into his body, kind of similar to what happened to Bruce. He experienced pulsing and contraction sensations in his abdomen. Bruce actually talks about when he prayed for Chris in my video that I recorded the other day, that Chris was like, please stop, this actually hurts. And Bruce is like, no, sorry, I'm not going to stop. Let's just let this continue. Some of this may sound a little bit strange, but this is just what's going on. This is what they reported. That night, Chris ate his first oral meal without complications. So he didn't spit the food out. He actually swallowed it. He didn't vomit. He didn't fall violently ill or anything like that. His primary care physician and gastroenterologist couldn't explain the resolution. They actually made him keep the apparatus in for a few more months. It was 4 months, but then they were eventually surgically removed when they were like, okay, obviously this has been some time. You don't need these. And so, yeah, this is documented as a medical case study. I believe it's been in some kind of journals. This particular case was discussed, if you want to check out the debate between Craig Keener and Dr. Joshua Brown. And I'm trying to remember the skeptic's name. He was a Christian, but he was very skeptical of miracles. I can't remember his name. I think he was just like a hardcore cessationist, but I can include that in the chat as well. But they discuss his case in more depth if you want to find out that, or like I said, go to my friend Than's channel. So that's Chris Gunderson. Here is Sister Bernadette Moreau. I think I'm pronouncing her name correctly. She traveled to Lourdes, France, 15 years ago. Now, for those of you who don't know, now I'm not Catholic, so this is one of those kind of miracle claims that, like, theologically I might be slightly uncomfortable with, but it's one of those miracles that I also can't necessarily say didn't happen. But basically, supposedly there was a Marian apparition that happened in Lourdes, I believe in the 1800s or so, and there had been some miracles that had come out of that, and people they do pilgrimages to Lourdes to this day. A lot of the supposed cures aren't really strong, but there are 70 ones that have been pretty seriously tested and confirmed. My own theological view of this is I think God will meet people where they're at, and I don't think you have to have perfect theology for God to do something to you, but I think he sees people's faith in him, or just maybe out of his own sovereignty, moves in this particular way. She definitely gives glory to God for her healing. But anyways, she joined one of the processions and she experienced what she believed was God's presence. So she kind of had like a religious experience there. She sensed the Holy Spirit. She returned home spiritually rejuvenated, but physically she felt worse and just really took a lot out of her and just didn't seem to be doing anything. She even talks about, and her case is documented in a 60 Minutes episode, which I can also share in the chat. She always thought miracles were like for somebody else, but not for her. So when she got back, she was in severe pain for 3 days. After 3 days, she felt like she had some strength to go ahead and walk to the chapel. So she did that and prayed. And after prayer, she experienced like a heat sensation. She felt very relaxed and she heard an inward voice tell her to remove the braces. So basically she was crippled. I don't think that I put on the slides what her conditions were, but I think she had some severe arthritic condition in her feet and different things like that. She had to walk with all kinds of braces. She was in really rough shape. And if you watch the interview with her on 60 Minutes, they go into her condition and how long she had it and all of that other stuff. So yep, that's what you guys get for being guinea pigs. I'll have to include more of those details in the slides next time. But she had her crooked foot was straightened, and she found that she could walk completely without pain. Multiple specialists examined her. Extensive medical tests were conducted. Investigation included neurologists, rheumatologists, imagery, and electrophysiology test were all conducted. Multiple specialists examined her. Oh, see, more guinea pig there. So I doubled there, but anyway, after 8 years of investigation, her cure was deemed medically unexplained. This is Dr. Alessandro de France. I'm not even going to try and pronounce that. Any of you French people want to fill me in later, but he said he's basically the president and presiding physician over the Lord's Office of Medical Observations. So he's the one who's making sure that if the church is going to validate and say this was a miracle, they better make sure that they've done all of their due diligence before they say anything. They are very strict with their criteria. He says that Sister Bernadette had been reviewed and evaluated by over 300 physicians. If any of our viewers who are doctors happen to visit Southern France and want to examine her case file, I'll be more than happy to show them. Our approach is open, collaborative, and transparent, no secrets. And he's saying that all of this is out there. You guys can investigate it all you want. We are confident in what happened with Sister Bernadette. One last example. This is Greg Spencer. He was a former police officer. He also became a semi-truck driver because he just didn't like some of the stresses of the job as a police officer. He had worked, I think, in kind of a rough area and had seen some bad crimes, different things like that, some stomach turning kind of things. So he wanted to get out of that into something a little more quiet. So he became a truck driver, but he began to suffer vision problems in his late 30s in August of 1998. And he was diagnosed with juvenile macular degeneration. And so basically he had become legally blind, which caused him not be able to drive trucks, obviously, anymore. He was 2,400 in his right eye, 2,200 in his left eye by May of 1999. So he rapidly just was getting worse and worse. He had to go on disability. He registered for the Oregon Commission of the Blind in 1999, and he began receiving disability payments. Here are, this is a letter from his doctor diagnosing Greg with macular degeneration. And so there is medical documentation for Greg's previous condition. And so here's more of that same letter there. And we Whoop. There we go. Whoop, skipped ahead. Bear with me, guys. So Greg, in 2002, he attended a men's retreat in April. He had to wear like really thick glasses. Couldn't read the print of his Bible. Because of some of the things that he saw as a police officer. He had a lot of past trauma, like post-traumatic stress disorder, I believe. And so he was asking for prayer, but he was asking for prayer. He was asking God to heal his mind. He wanted the trauma gone. That was at least where he was at as far as faith goes. And what happened is he had his eyes closed during this particular time of prayer when he was praying for God to heal his mind. He sensed the presence of God. He felt like God was kind of mending some of those internal wounds in his mind. But to his surprise, when he opened up his eyes, he could see. And he was absolutely shocked. The story goes that he went out to the parking lot and started reading license plates from as far as he possibly could. As he was driving home, he was reading the license plates. He was reading signs. He was doing all this stuff. He was extremely excited, as you could imagine. 2 weeks later, ophthalmology records record near perfect and instantaneous improvement, uncorrected acuity of now 20/30. The Social Security Administration actually investigated Greg for fraud, but concluded obviously from his medical records that he really was blind, but now that he could see. And you guys can see on the screen there what 2400 and 2200 looks like. Obviously what Greg could see is very, very, very little. Now he has basically near perfect vision. And so I think that's a pretty strong case. And again, it's medically documented. This is the letter that was sent to the Social Security Administration, because obviously when you can see, you don't get disability anymore. You can go back to work. And so this is again another case that is just medically unexplained and in the context of prayer. So those are the examples. So why again bring up modern miracles? Well, if miracles occur in the modern world, this informs our background knowledge. There is no reason to a priori reject the Gospels as just being partially true when it comes to maybe recording some mundane events. And a lot of times skeptics, they won't even grant you that. Everything's this heavy redactive theological stuff going on and they're just making up. But anyway, even if they grant that they were right on reporting everything, they don't grant the miracles. They say that those are greatly embellished. And so, but if contemporary miracles are consistently reported within Christianity and cannot be explained naturally, this is just the tip of the iceberg. I just gave you guys 4. As Jonathan mentioned, there are many, many good cases that are reported in Moreland's book and Larmer's book that Lee Strobel talks about. I think Jonathan has a few other examples that we can discuss as well. And so this is just the tip of the iceberg. There are many of these that are out there that are reported that are very credible. As I mentioned, even with the case with Lourdes, even though a lot of the supposed miracles are bunk, 70 of them have went through this kind of rigorous criteria since they started happening there with different doctors and different things like that. These miracles align with the claims of Christian theology regarding divine intervention. They're in the context of prayer. There's a religious atmosphere going on. There's often some kind of faith or divine intervention in the background of this person's knowledge. And so thus the occurrence of these miracles provide evidential support for Christianity's truth claims and enhances the credibility of the gospel accounts. And so there's no reason to think that they're just making these things up if this is part of our background knowledge that these things still happen today. If Jesus really rose from the dead and he really is who he says he is, then we have lots of different things in the Gospels where, I mean, even in Acts, like these things were continuing to happen. There's no reason to think that they would cease. And this is one way that, as a sign, that points to the truth of Christianity. And it goes back to that, maybe that hardened skeptics who's just heard a lot of bad information. Again, maybe they don't understand our cumulative argument for the reliability of the Gospels, but it's kind of hard to see somebody who's basically been raised from the dead and regrows their intestine, or had a paralyzed stomach and suddenly after prayer doesn't, or has blind eyes and now can see, or is completely basically crippled and now can walk. Those are some things that we see Jesus doing in the Gospels, right? And so I think that's it. Jonathan mentioned all of these different books here. Again, this is just the tip of the iceberg. And so, yeah, that is the presentation. And Jonathan does have other examples that he can share with you guys. I know, well, Jonathan, I'll let you kind of take it from here.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Eric, for that really interesting and informative presentation of contemporary miracles. So I'm just going to show short videos, about I think it's 9 minutes or something, where Lee Strobel talks about and interviews Barbara Schneider. She was healed of multiple sclerosis, which was in a very advanced state. It was way beyond the relapsing and remitting stage of multiple sclerosis. And Barbara Schneider was completely crippled, like her legs had atrophied and her feet had curled up, and she was blind, and she had feeding tubes and so forth. And I'll let Lee Strobel express the story, and her also express the story in her own words as well in the interview. So I'll share my screen here so that you can see. Okay, so I'm going to play this.
Friends, it's amazing, isn't it? This was a rigorous scientific study that was accepted for publication in a major secular peer-reviewed medical journal. And the professor in charge of this research, who I interview in my book, The Case for Miracles, Dr. Candy Gunther Brown of Indiana University, said this. This is what she told me. She said, "Our study shows that something is going on." I want to say, duh, but no. She said, "This is more than just wishful thinking. It's not fakery. It's not fraud. It's not some televangelist trying to get widows to send in their money. It's not a highly charged atmosphere that plays on people's emotions. Something," she said, "is going on." And I agree. You know what? I think it's something supernatural. And I think it's a miracle of God. Now, outspoken critic and atheist who I mentioned earlier, Dr. Jerry Coyne of the University of Chicago, said that in his opinion, to have confidence that a miracle actually took place, we would need to have, in his words, massive, well-documented, and either replicated or independently corroborated evidence from multiple and reliable sources. And he said, no religious miracle has ever come close to meeting those standards. Now, I would challenge that. But you know what else I would do? I would challenge him on the standard he set for miracles and say, what if I introduced you to someone whose miracle meets your standard? That is, where we have massive, well-documented, and independently corroborated evidence from multiple and reliable sources. What if I introduced him to a woman named Barbara Schneider? Let me tell you about Barbara Schneider. She is the most fascinating case I discovered during my 2-year investigation. It just blew my mind. Her case is the most thoroughly documented of any that I encountered. I interviewed Barbara at length. There are years and years of massive scientific and medical evidence of her case, including from the Mayo Clinic. We have multiple credible eyewitnesses with no motive to deceive or to lie. We have 2 physicians who were so astounded by what happened to her, they wrote books about it. In fact, one of her physicians was an atheist, and he looked at her and he said, "Barbara, this is a miracle." And then he walked out of the room. I don't think he knew what to do with it. But let me tell you Barbara's story, and then I want you to hear her words from her. Barbara was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis at the Mayo Clinic. After years of deterioration and repeated hospitalizations and surgeries, she was in hospice in bed at her home. In other words, she was dying. One of her physicians, Dr. Harold P. Adolph, who was a board-certified surgeon who performed 25,000 operations in his career, he called Barbara, quote, one of the most hopelessly ill patients I ever saw. Hopelessly ill, he said. One of her lungs was non-functional. The other lung was just 50% inflated. A tracheostomy tube was inserted into her neck, and oxygen was being pumped from her garage so she could breathe. She had lost control of her urination and her bowels. She had a tube in her stomach so she could be fed. She was legally blind. She'd lost her eyesight. All she could see was shadows, gray shadows. She had not walked in 7 years, and so her legs had atrophied till they were just sticks. Her hands were permanently curled. Her fingers were virtually touching her wrists, and her toes, her feet were permanently extended. And her parents and the doctors agreed there was nothing more they could do medically. She was in hospice. She was going to die. They said the next time she contracts pneumonia, let's not try to save her because it's just going to postpone her inevitable death. Then one day, a friend of hers called up WMBI, which is the Christian radio station in Chicago. She lived in suburban Chicago. And told her and said, my friend Barbara's dying. And could you just let people know on the radio that to pray for her? And so we know that at least 450 people began praying for Barbara because they wrote letters affirming that they were praying for her. So what happened? I went to Barbara and I asked her to tell you what happened. So let's watch her describe what occurred next.
June 7th, 1981, I'll never forget it. It was a day like any other day for me. That was one spent confined to bed, unable to breathe on my own, hooked up to machines, a tracheostomy tube in my neck, my arms curled up, my legs curled up. I lay there trapped inside my own body is really how it felt. I had 2 friends over. They came over all the time. They were from my church. My church family never forgot me. So while they were there, I still remember exactly what they were reading when all of a sudden I heard a booming, authoritative, loud voice over my shoulder over here say, my child, get up and walk.
And there was nobody else in the room?
And there was no one else in the room, and the door was over here. There were windows over this way. And instantly I knew it was God. But instantly I also knew that my friends didn't hear that, which is kind of interesting too.
Yeah.
And I needed to share with them what I heard. Well, I had this tracheostomy tube in my neck, that's how I breathed, and I had hands that did not work. So my friends said whenever I looked agitated, they knew I wanted to talk. So they'd come and plug the hole in my neck. And I said, I don't know what you're gonna think about this, but God just told me to get up and walk. And my friends got really quiet. I know, but he really did tell me to get up and walk. Run, get my family. I want them to be here. And my friends all of a sudden jumped up, and while they jumped, so did I. I was so excited I couldn't wait for anyone. And I literally jumped out of the bed. This is where you'd almost have to have known me to see how totally impossible that was. So this time, I remember reaching up and pulling my oxygen off my neck. I remember that. And then I jumped toward the voice. My friends are over here, but I jumped towards the voice. And as I jumped up, the first thing I remember isn't what I would think I would remember, but I jumped out of the bed and I looked and I saw my feet. They were flat on the ground, just like everyone else's, which sounds normal, but not for me. I had foot drops so badly I couldn't even wear slippers on my feet. They were so curled. So when I jumped up to have feet flat, I was amazed and stood staring at my feet. And when I did that, I jumped like this, and then I saw my hands, and they were open, and they never opened. And so now they were open, and I stood staring at them, and then it dawned on me I could see me. That's what I would have thought I would have noticed first, was my vision, but I didn't.
It was back, you could see.
It was back, I was perfectly fine. And I stood staring again for a little while, just feeling what it felt like to look at and see me. And then I turned, and that's when we were like, we all started jumping up and down, screaming and thanking the Lord. I remember I didn't understand anything, except where once I was real sick, I was well again. And it has to be God. That's all I knew.
Barbara's in bed. She hears a voice, "My child, get up and walk." She jumps out of bed. She's instantly and totally healed. Her mother comes running into the room, drops to her knees, and begins to feel her legs. Say, "You have calves again." Her legs had atrophied because she hadn't walked in 7 years, and her muscles returned instantaneously. Her father came in the room and hugged her and began waltzing with her around the room. And that night, her church, which is Wheaton Wesleyan Church in Wheaton, Illinois, was holding a service. And the pastor gets up and he says, "Does anybody have any announcements?" And Barbara starts walking down the aisle. And all the church ever knew of Barbara was Barbara in a wheelchair, and blind, and she's walking down the aisle, and people just spontaneously began to shout and applaud and cheer, and they broke into songs, said, "Amazing grace, I once was blind, and now I see." And the next morning, she went to one of her doctors, Dr. Thomas Marshall, an internist for 30 years. And when he saw her, his first thought was, "Oh, she must have died, and this is a ghost." His response was, quote, "This is medically impossible." Friends, God instantly and completely and astoundingly healed Barbara in one miraculous moment. There is no natural explanation for what occurred. Besides, how would you explain the voice that told her, against everything she could imagine, that she needed to get up and walk? Today, she has been totally healthy for more than 35 years. She's healthier than I am. I'm interviewing her, and I'm just... And she's married to a pastor, and they've got a church in Fredericksburg, Virginia. And I want to quote to you what her physician wrote, quote, "I have never witnessed anything like this before or since, and considered it a rare privilege to observe the hand of God performing a true miracle." I mean, that, friends, it's astounding. How do you explain that? How do you explain that? This is just one of several cases that I discuss and document in my book, The Case for Miracles.
So it's a pretty phenomenal example. At the time of the publication of Lee Strubble's book, The Case for Miracles, she'd been healed for more than 35 years. So this is not simply a relapse and remission type of situation. And this is, it occurred, of course, in the context of prayer. And it was a complete, not merely a gradual remission. And there was medical documentation, and there were eyewitnesses that can attest to the before and after condition. So that's pretty much as good as it gets in terms of evidential value in confirming the truth of Christianity from the argument from contemporary miracles. One of the advantages of having such a diversity of examples of healing miracles is that we're not just talking about lots of examples of the same sort of thing, but we're talking, and so you might be able to say, well, maybe there's some sort of naturalistic explanation for this that we just don't know yet. Rather, it spans such a diversity of examples that in order to account for on naturalism, you have to really scotch tape together various auxiliary hypotheses or hold out hope that we'll find various explanations for these things, rather than just subscribing to one single explanation that explains all of the data in one fell swoop, namely the hypothesis that God exists and that he performs miracles in answer to prayer. There are more than merely healing miracles, though, that one can document. For example, there are miracles where people have been able to speak in tongues in the sense that they've been able to communicate and express the gospel in foreign languages that they couldn't otherwise speak. And this is something that is very difficult to be honestly mistaken about. And there's such a diversity of credible sources that attest to this sort of miracle. that it leads me to think that there's something to it. So, for example, Dr. Craig Keener, in his book on miracles in Volume 1, he discusses a friend of his called Leo Bawa, who was the former director of research at KPRO, prominent Nigerian missions movement. And one intriguing miracle of several that he told Dr. Keener about is that, I'm quoting, among some tribes in Adamawa and Taraba State, I had instances where no interpreter was available, and the Lord gave me understanding and ability to speak the people's languages, a feat I never performed before or since after that incident, end quote. And Keener notes that, quote, other accounts of this phenomenon exist, though many of these are secondhand, end quote. And then he provides a footnote in which he elaborates, quote, I have direct accounts of which others recognize the languages from Dr. Derek Morphew, November 12, 2007, Pastor David Workman, November 12, 2007, Pastor David Workman, April 30th, 2008, Dr. Medine Keener, that's his wife, as it happens, and presumably he considers her a trustworthy source, August 12th, 2009, secondhand about Pastor Daniel Ndungu, my student, Leah Lekinskis, April 25, 2010, regarding her Jewish mother becoming a believer in Jesus because she understood the Hebrew prayer of an uneducated pastor's prayer in tongues. Del Tar, personal correspondence, September 30, 2010, noting 3 cases he had witnessed, including a recent one involving Korean, end quote. So there's a diversity of credible sources that attest to this sort of miracle phenomenon of being able to speak foreign languages to proclaim the gospel. And indeed, I've heard about this sort of phenomenon from others as well, besides Dr. Keener, and it does not seem to be the type of thing that could be easily explained naturalistically. I know Dr. Keener personally, and I trust him, and I presume that he trusts his sources, since these are personal contacts of his, including his wife. And the fact that the phenomenon is multiply tested, of course, helps as well. And so it seems unlikely in these cases that Keener's sources are all lying to him. The more diverse sources you have, the less likely it is that they're all lying. And especially when these are personal contacts of his, whom he presumably trusts. And these also seem to be phenomena about which it would be quite difficult to be honestly mistaken. And one might, of course, object that the testimony is coming from someone that they don't know personally, but with public figures such as Dr. Keener, one can, to a certain degree, evaluate whether this is someone who is likely to make stuff up. Another public figure who happens to be a good friend of mine is Dr. Michael Brown. He's a biblical scholar. He's best known for his work on answering Jewish objections to Jesus, but he's also a charismatic, and he's told me on public record, there's a YouTube video where I interview Dr. Brown, and this is coming from that. He told me about similar events to those that I just described, both that he was a witness to personally and also testimonies of friends of his, including one individual who was a cessationist and therefore not already predisposed to believe in miraculous events, who reported the incident to Dr. Brown in shock. And the fact that this sort of occurrence is multiply tested by different credible sources leads me to think that something miraculous is indeed going on here. And I like this particular category of miracle claim because it's one type of phenomenon that seems to defy naturalistic explanation, and also seems to be something that it would be very difficult to be honestly wrong about having witnessed. So that's just another example to add there. Now, the most popular pushback that I get when it comes to contemporary miracles is, well, why doesn't God heal everyone, right? Why does God sometimes not heal in answer to prayer? And that is certainly true. Everyone knows what it's like to pray and have their prayers go apparently unanswered. And what I would say there is that there is, in my mind, an epistemic asymmetry, such that the cases where God apparently does perform miraculous healing are stronger in terms of their evidential value than the counterexamples are in terms of their evidential value for disconfirming Christianity. Because on Christianity, we have resources to explain cases where God might choose not to heal someone from a particular condition. And these are supplied to us in Scripture. Perhaps God wants to use our suffering for soul building, for example, or there's all kinds of explanations for why God might choose not to heal. And on the other hand, though, there's far fewer resources on naturalism to explain and give an account of the cases where God apparently does perform miraculous healing. So the cases where God apparently does come through to heal someone in answer to prayer is, in my judgment, stronger evidence for the existence of God, and in particular Christian theism, than the counterexamples are in disconfirming it. So that's also an important point to bear in mind. But we can conclude there, and if anyone has any questions or pushback comments, then we are happy to entertain any discussion.